Peter Schiff, President and Chief Global Strategist of Euro-Pacific, best-selling author. Welcome back, Peter.
Thanks for having me on again.
Over the last 3 years, housing has undergone a depression, unlike really anything we've seen in about 75 years. A lot of blame has been directed towards the banks, but not as much as far as the government's actions are concerned. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Ginnie Mae, FHA, all primary culprits that led this housing bubble higher decade after decade. A nearly endless supply of money.
There's no question that the housing bubble and the subsequent collapse was a creature that was entirely made by government. It doesn't mean that the private sector didn't have a part in it, but it was only because it was playing the distorted hand dealt to it by the government. Absent all the government intervention in the housing market, this never would have happened. It would have been impossible. Market forces would have prevented it. The keys to the housing bubble were twofold. One, it was the Federal Reserve and having interest rates much too low, much lower than the market would have set them, which made it easier for people to buy overpriced homes because they could afford the teaser rates on their mortgages. And just as important, or maybe even more important, were the government guarantees, so that people who were buying homes that they obviously could not afford, they were still getting mortgages because the government stood behind them. You had entities like Fannie and Freddie and the FHA that were not only guaranteeing these risky mortgages, but were buying the risky mortgages that were underwritten by third parties. And in fact, most of the bad mortgages that were created by the banks never would have been created if the banks didn't know they can turn around and sell them to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So the government is what polluted the pot. The government caused the problem, and now government solutions are making the problems worse, not only for the housing market, but for the economy in general.
Instead of letting these pseudo-government-sponsored enterprises go bankrupt, they bailed them out to the tune of $5 trillion. Doesn't that just make this problem persist even longer?
Well, absolutely. And while a lot of the subprime mortgage lenders went out of business, the FHA took over all of their business. The FHA is now the subprime lender. It's all being done by the government now. None of the subprime loans are being done in the private sector, but they're being done in the public sector. And Fannie and Freddie are now guaranteeing more mortgages than ever before, and so the federal government is now explicitly on the hook now, because the government has now given Fannie and Freddie an unlimited line of credit. We have said that we will put taxpayers behind all these mortgages, which is why if you look at mortgage interest rates right now, the 30-year U.S. Treasury bond and 30-year fixed-rate mortgages are almost identical. And that's because investors are indifferent between mortgages and Treasury debt because they're one and the same at this point. And so every American puts the U.S. Treasury on the hook every time they buy a house, which is a recipe for disaster.
About 90 to 95% of all loans are being underwritten by the U.S. government. But shouldn't the housing market be outside the reins of government? Isn't that what makes a robust economy?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the reason that the government is trying to prop up housing prices, or the reason the government is intervening the way they are, it's because they want to prop up housing prices. They want to prevent houses from falling in price. They want it to stay artificially expensive so that people have to borrow lots of money to buy houses that, absent all these props, would be a lot less expensive, requiring much smaller mortgages. And the other reason they want to do that is to maintain the illusion of bank solvency, because banks have a lot of mortgages as assets on their books, and if real estate prices are allowed to fall to where the market wants them, a lot more people will walk away from their mortgages, and that will expose the insolvency in our banking system, and the government doesn't want to do that. It wants to cover up the insolvency, and so it does that by trying to artificially prop up home prices, but in doing that, it makes the housing problem worse, and it prevents the market from solving it.
We're not allowing the froth to leave the system. We have a huge number of shadow inventory, or RIOs, that are, as you say, sitting on those banks' balance sheets. They've not been marked to market. It's marked to make believe. And until those millions of homes that aren't even on the MLS yet, until that happens, this system is not going to be cleared out.
And we have to ask the question, I mean, why should the government come in and guarantee mortgages? I mean, they don't guarantee a credit card debt. If I want to go out and I want to buy a plasma TV, they don't guarantee that loan. But if I decide I want to go out and buy a McMansion, why should the government guarantee that? I mean, we have to allow housing prices and decisions as to whether people buy or rent to be made based on the market, not based on government guarantees. Because when you do that, you don't have a free market. You have the opposite of a free market. You have a government centrally planned market which causes disasters. And the problem is, though, when the disaster comes, they blame the free market. There is no free market in housing. There hasn't been a free market in housing in a long time.
I'd make the parallel. What if the government subsidized or guaranteed your mutual funds? Absolutely
yeah, but
right.
The government is trying to guarantee to lenders that if you loan money to somebody to buy a house, if they don't pay it back, the government will pay it back. Well, what does that mean? That means lending standards are reduced. That means banks make loans that absent those government guarantees, they wouldn't have made. The government guarantees are there. The government is trying to get the market to do things that it wouldn't do on its own.
All right, let's talk about the amazing moves we've seen in commodities. Copper continues to defy gravity, hitting new records almost every week. Silver, of course, not too far from $30 an ounce. This is traditionally a favorable season for commodities. Do you see further upside as we move into spring of 2011?
Absolutely. I see a lot of upside in commodities and precious metals because I see a lot of downside in fiat currencies. And, the metals, they're simply responding to the increased quantity of money. It's like, I'm about 6 feet tall, but if you measured my height with a 6-inch ruler and you claimed that a foot was 6 inches, I wouldn't be defying gravity at 12 feet tall. I'm the same height I always was. It's just that the ruler is smaller. And so that's what's happening. I mean, central banks are creating money, so they are reducing the value of money, and so we're measuring commodity prices with smaller rulers. And so as a result, there's a bigger number there, but it's not really changing.
I'm sure you probably heard about this zero contango situation developing in the silver market, when that's zero contango, where we actually have every single futures price lower than the current spot price. And this simply means there are a lot more buyers than sellers, especially in the short term. What do you make of this situation?
People are figuring out what's going on. When you have a Fed chairman like Ben Bernanke who is basically saying there's no connection whatsoever between the money he's printing and rising